Welcome back to our live coverage of the 6th International Community-Based Adaptation Conference coming from Hanoi in Vietnam. You've just been listening to Margarita Wallström, who's been talking about some of the impacts that people have been facing through disasters and some of the mechanisms and adaptation mechanisms that are being applied to reduce those. Some startling statistics there. Populations in disaster-prone areas have increased by as much as 100 to 200% in the last 30 years alone. This is the kind of thing that we should be expecting people to be worrying about, but it's not being picked up by the media as we would hope, and that's going to kind of form my segue into our next next element here. I'm delighted to welcome Mike Shanahan of IIED. Mike, you're going to talk to us a little bit about why the media aren't really addressing these issues in the way that we would hope, and you delivered a talk earlier today on how do we get the kind of the stories from the front lines of climate change, if you like, to the front lines of the newspapers. So perhaps we could begin by kind of sketching out the situation as it is at the moment regarding climate change in media. What's the coverage like?
Well, the coverage leaves something to be desired, should we say, in terms of the scale of the problem that we're facing and the amount of coverage that you see in newspapers and broadcast media. In some countries, certainly in the United States and in Europe, the coverage has been in decline recently, ever since the big conference in Copenhagen that really didn't achieve what people thought it would. But in developing countries, coverage is increasing, and there's an evolution in terms of the quality and the quantity of the coverage. But I think one of the issues here is there's a misconception about what the media is for. A lot of people think that it's the media's job to save the world, and it's not. It's journalists' job, in most cases, to sell newspapers. They work for private companies mostly, and they're not here sitting around waiting for somebody to give them some information that they can just reproduce. So I think many people who work on climate change have an expectation that they can use the media, and that's a course that is set for failure. Instead, I think people in this sector, people who are working for NGOs and research organizations, need to have a better understanding of the media and, in fact, know it and serve it rather than thinking that they can use it.
And are we to take from that then, if the situation currently is poor, does that mean we're doing a bad job at presenting stories, climate stories, to the media?
In many cases, yes. I mean, there's also a challenge in that the media is often very interested in things that are new, and climate change isn't new. We've known the basic science of climate change for a long, long time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up 24 years ago. We've had a UN agreement signed by most countries around the world for 20 years on climate change. And so when you have things like ice is melting, temperature is rising, this isn't really very new. And so journalists find it very difficult when they go to their editors to say, I want to do a story on climate change, because in fact there's nothing new in much of what we're communicating about as the climate concerned community.
But it's not only that it's not new, though, is it? We heard Harjit Singh of ActionAid earlier today saying that maybe less than 50% of US citizens believe that climate change is man-made. You would have thought that if this message had been hammered home over the last 20 years, at the very least it would be accepted. So it seems there's other challenges there as well. Why aren't people taking this on board, do you think?
Well, the US is a special case because the US also has a very strong fundamentalist Christian population. They also have a very large percentage of people who don't believe in evolution. And so, that aside, in broader contexts around the world, there's another issue of how we've been communicating about climate change, which is doom and gloom. People have been hammering home this story, the world's going to end, everyone's going to die, the planet's going to cook. And frankly, I'm bored of that, and my mum and dad are bored of that, and normal people who don't spend their days reading reports on climate change just don't care about that terrible message. They'd rather read the football scores, or they'd rather find out what Lady Gaga's going to sing about next week. So there's been a failure to really appreciate what works in communication, I think. There's been an idea that if we just keep banging on about something really terrible, then everybody will see sense. And that model of communication isn't actually held up by research into how people think and behave in response to information.
So how does that relate to this conference here? We're talking about community-based adaptation. What can we take, what broader lessons can we take about communicating climate change to be applied to adaptation and community-based adaptation specifically?
Well, one of the things that we're hearing a lot in this conference and through the field trips that have preceded it is that there are good news stories to tell. It's not all doom and gloom. All across the world, in some of the world's poorest countries, people are doing things to respond to the changes that they're seeing in the climate. And these changes are things that maybe the weather is changing in terms of the rainfall or the arrival of the drought or the wet season. And people have always changed. They've always responded to change, and that kind of resilience is a feature of humanity. And what we're seeing now that these changes are becoming a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit more widespread and somewhat more severe, is that there are solutions that people are able to develop on the ground in villages at very small scales that can actually help them reduce their risk, increase their food security, respond to disaster threats in ways that enable them to survive rather than perish. And these sorts of things are what we need to be able to find out about. Do they really work? Can they be translated to other communities, other countries? Can they be scaled up? And that's the kind of thing that we're learning about at this conference here.
Do you think we risk reinforcing kind of quite a negative value set if we accept that people don't care about future generations? If we just say, okay, well, we can't keep banging on about disasters because people aren't bothered. Do you think that we risk, if we accept that, then actually why should we expect people to care about people a long way away either? If a flood in Bangladesh, why should that worry me in the UK or in the US if I'm not worried about my own children?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of people don't care about the people who live next door to them, in their own communities. And that's the nature of us as a species, and especially as a modern species, is that some of us are very individualistic and some of us are very humanitarian in our outlooks. But everything, I think, to do with climate change is going to boil down to our own futures, our own lives, before we start thinking about people in different parts of the world. And equally, those people in different parts of the world, in Bangladesh or in Africa, they will be finding solutions to climate change in their own villages, in their own towns and cities. And that's where action will happen. And that's where governments and private companies will be able to interact with people in a local situation. We can't expect climate change to be solved by just people feeling compassionate with strangers on the other side of the planet, because I don't think that's going to work. Really, if people want to respond to climate change, it's going to have to come within their own communities.
Sounds like maybe an effective strategy and a damning indictment on humanity all in one. In light of that, are we seeing kind of a lot of media coverage of climate change in developing countries where these problems are hitting first, worst? Is coverage there increasing in response to that?
Coverage is increasing in developing countries by and large, but it's still at a low level. The number of journalists, in particular in Africa, who have got the support of their editors and have got the training that they need to do this kind of reporting in depth is low. There are some things that can be done to help this, and particularly for journalists, if they can get out of the city, out of the newsroom, and go and see communities who are feeling impacts of climate variability and climate change, and also to see what they're doing about it. That's what needs to happen. They need to get out and see it, but they need support of their editors. And I think one thing that we've seen a lot of in the last 5 or 10 years is a lot of support and training programs for journalists, including programs I've been involved in. But really, editors are the people who make the decisions, and until editors see that this is an issue that really they and their readers and their audiences have an interest in, then you can train all the journalists in the world you like, but if the editor says no, the editor says no.
It's interesting, actually, when we were covering the Copenhagen conference, I remember chatting to a journalist from a very senior international broadcasting institution who told me that he had a very clear line that he had to follow, which actually was the climate gate, or controversy or non-controversy at the time. So it's interesting, you should highlight that we need to be speaking to the editors. So what do you see as the kind of the vision for the future then, in terms of communicating climate change, connecting the dots between extreme weather, joining up good adaptation stories? How can we progress this?
Well, what we're seeing already is increasingly the Western newspapers are taking on more stories written by journalists in developing countries. And so we're seeing a breakdown of those traditional sort of Westerners reporting on the developing countries. Instead, it's the actual voices of the journalists who know what the situation is. So that's an interesting development. So we're seeing more of that stories coming from the south coming to audiences in the north. We're seeing an awful lot more journalists in developing countries who are on top of this story now. They've been reporting climate change for 5 or 6 years, sometimes longer, and they're the experts now in their countries. They're already setting up associations of climate change journalists. They're organizing training for their colleagues. They're the leaders, and some of them are doing a hell of a lot better job than many better resourced journalists in the United States and Europe. So I think we also have to start thinking about how can reporters all around the United States do a better job of this story, rather than just the really good journalists who are well-resourced and have been covering climate change for 20 years at the New York Times and Washington Post. What about small newspapers in Texas and other places like that are just as vulnerable, really, to big climatic extremes?
It sounds like there's some lessons to be learned, kind of very much in all directions, not just a top-down, north to south approach. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great to have your insights, and we'll probably try and catch up with you later in the conference as well to hear the lessons you've picked up. We're going to go to a video from Christiana Figueres now. It's the address that she actually had delivered to the conference. She chose a low carbon option, and so had a video sent over. So we'll just play that in, and then we'll be joined by Salim Al-Hook, who is a senior fellow at IIED, and he's going to give us a little bit of an update on the first day from the conference here in Hanoi.